Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside to grab your mail, only to find a bright red violation notice slapped onto your front door like a mark of shame. The offense? Parking in my own driveway. At first, I laughed. Surely this had to be a mistake. I owned my driveway, my house, my land, my car. No way could some overreaching homeowners association tell me otherwise. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. I had unknowingly walked into a war zone. When I bought my house, I thought I was stepping into the American dream, a beautiful home in a pristine, well-manicured neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors waved as they watered their lawns, kids played on the sidewalks, and weekend barbecues filled the air with the smell of sizzling burgers. It was picture perfect. Until I met Karen. Karen, the HOA president, wasn't just a stickler for rules, she was a dictator in heels, a tyrant with a clipboard and a thirst for power that would make a Roman emperor jealous. Short blonde bob, perpetual scowl, and the unmistakable aura of someone who thrived on making others miserable. She didn't just enforce the rules, she was the rules, and her army of nodding minions, other board members too spineless to question her, ensured that every absurd decree she made was followed without hesitation. I should have seen the warning signs my neighbor had tried to warn me the day I moved in. "Careful where you park," he muttered, nodding toward my car. I chuckled. "What, they don't like Toyotas?" "It's not the car," he whispered. "It's Karen." I shrugged it off. After all, I owned my driveway. What could she possibly do? A week later, I got my answer. The violation notice read like something out of a dystopian nightmare. Unauthorized vehicle storage, immediate compliance required. My car, clean, undamaged, fully functional, was deemed an eyesore that disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. Furious, I called the HOA office. Karen answered, her voice thick with fake politeness. "Oh yes, I was wondering when you'd call." She practically purred. "We've received multiple complaints about your vehicle being left outside." "From who?" I demanded. "I'm afraid that information is confidential," she said sweetly. "But rules are rules. You'll need to move it into your garage." I laughed, disbelieving. "My car isn't broken down. It's not covered in graffiti. It's just parked. In my driveway." Karen chuckled, that smug, self-satisfied sound that made my blood boil. "I understand your frustration, but I strongly suggest you comply. Otherwise, there will be fines." And that's when I knew. This wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics. It was about control. Karen had pushed me, and she had no idea I was about to push back. I wasn't about to let Karen strong-arm me into submission, not when I had the facts on my side. I dove into the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and CC&Rs, determined to find the exact rule she was referencing, and guess what? It didn't exist. Nowhere in those tedious legal documents did it say I couldn't park in my own driveway. Armed with that knowledge, I walked into the next HOA meeting, ready to shut Karen down once and for all. The room was packed, mostly with homeowners who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. They stared at their laps, shuffled papers, or avoided eye contact as Karen droned on about flower bed heights, mailbox uniformity, and other petty nonsense. Then it was my turn. I stood up, held my violation notice high, and spoke with calm confidence. "The fine you issued me isn't supported by the CC&Rs, I said, my voice cutting through the dull murmurs. "There's no rule against parking in my own driveway." Karen didn't even flinch. Instead, she smiled, that slow, predatory smirk that sent a chill down my spine. It was the kind of smile a cat gives before sinking its claws into a helpless mouse. "Oh, but there is a rule," she purred. "A rule about maintaining neighborhood aesthetics. And your car, it simply doesn't meet the standard." I laughed, shaking my head in disbelief. "So you just make up rules as you go?" Before Karen could respond, one of her lackeys, a wheezy-looking man in a too-tight blazer, piped up, "The board has discretionary power to interpret aesthetic violations." Translation, they could fine me for literally anything they didn't like. Karen leaned forward, her smile widening like she was savoring every second of this. "Since you're refusing to comply, we'll be issuing a $250 fine for noncompliance, and if the car remains in your driveway, it'll be an additional $50 per day." I could feel my blood pressure rising. "This is ridiculous. You can't just invent rules and steal people's money." Karen's eyes sparkled with something close to delight. "Oh, but we can," she said smoothly. "And if you don't pay, we'll have legal grounds to place a lien on your house." That was it. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with rational people. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood looking nice. This was about power, and Karen was loving every second of it. I stormed home, fists clenched. My first instinct was to hire a lawyer and take this to court, but that's exactly what Karen wanted. Months of bureaucratic red tape HOA hearings, and endless legal threats. She thrived on dragging people through the mud until they either gave up or caved in. No, I wasn't going to fight her battle. I was going to beat her at her own game. I spent the next few hours poring over the HOA bylaws, combing through every clause and subsection, looking for anything I could use to turn the tables. And then, buried deep in the fine print, I found it. The golden ticket. A tiny section under property modifications stated that homeowners had the right to install structures for security purposes as long as they followed city zoning law. And just like that, an idea was born. If Karen thought my car was an eyesore, I was about to give her something much bigger to complain about. The next morning, I made a call to a contractor. If the HOA wanted to fine me for parking in my own driveway, I was going to make sure they never even saw my driveway again. The moment I hung up, I felt a surge of adrenaline. There was no turning back now. Karen and her minions wanted to play dirty? Fine. I was about to bury them in their own rules. My plan was simple. Make my property untouchable, and thanks to the HOA's own bylaws, I had the perfect way to do it. I headed straight to City Hall, met with the zoning department, and after a brief but enlightening conversation, walked out with official confirmation I could in fact install a massive security gate at the entrance of my driveway. As long as it stayed within my property line and met height restrictions, the HOA couldn't do a damn thing about it. And Karen? She had no idea what was coming. Karen's face twisted in fury, her fingers tightening around her clipboard as she realized she had lost this round. But if there was one thing I had learned about her, it was that she didn't accept defeat. She schemed, she manipulated, and she always came back swinging. The construction continued. The sound of drills and metal striking concrete echoing through the neighborhood like a battle drum. My fortress was taking shape, and with every steel panel bolted into place, I could feel Karen's grip on the community slipping. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispered to one another on sidewalks, and some even dared to step outside to watch. A few of them looked intrigued, some even pleased. Others, the ones still terrified of Karen's wrath, just shook their heads and scurried back inside. 3 days later, my masterpiece stood tall, a 10-foot behemoth of reinforced steel, a monument to HOA defiance, a final, undeniable middle finger to Karen's tyranny. No longer would I wake up to violation notices taped to my door. No longer would my property be at the mercy of arbitrary, aesthetic fines. But Karen, of course, wasn't done. The very next morning, a familiar bright red paper was waiting for me, fluttering against my door in the breeze. Violation notice. Unauthorized structure, immediate removal required. I actually laughed out loud. Oh, Karen, you really don't learn, do you? I grabbed a thick red marker, circled the violation, and wrote in bold capital letters, "Denied. Please refer to Section 4.3 of your own bylaws." Then, in a moment of pure pettiness, I took a leisurely stroll to the HOA office, taped my response directly to their front door, and walked away like an action movie hero, leaving an explosion in the background. The next email from Karen arrived that evening. Subject: Emergency HOA meeting. Mandatory attendance required. Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world. The meeting was a spectacle. Karen, still reeling from my blatant refusal to bow down, launched into a dramatic rant about community spirit and neighborhood harmony. She tried to turn the other homeowners against me, painting me as some kind of rogue anarchist, single-handedly destroying the community's charm. It didn't work. I think it's great, one neighbor chimed in. I've been thinking about putting up a privacy gate myself. Yeah, another added. Honestly, I might do the same. Keeps nosy people out. Karen's eye twitched. You can't seriously think this is acceptable, she hissed. I leaned forward, my tone calm but firm. Karen, everything I did is within the bylaws. The gate is legal, it follows all city codes, and you cannot fine me. You cannot make me take it down. I let that sink in before delivering the final blow. But you can keep harassing me, and if you do, I'll have no choice but to involve my lawyer. And trust me, Karen, I'd love to discuss this in a courtroom. Silence. Dead silence. Karen's face turned a shade of red I didn't know was possible. One of her own board members, clearly tired of her nonsense, cleared his throat. I think we should table this discussion, he muttered. The meeting ended abruptly. Karen stormed out, defeated, and as I walked out of that HOA office, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Because if Karen couldn't beat me with rules, she was going to come after me with something else. 2 days later, another bright red notice appeared on my door. Noise violation, unauthorized construction. I almost choked on my coffee. My construction had been finished for over a week. They were just making things up. Now then another fine. Trash bin violation, misaligned with curb, and another. Grass height exceeds aesthetic standards. By the end of the week, I had received 5 separate violation notices, each more ridiculous than the last. Karen was throwing everything at me, hoping to wear me down, to drown me in paperwork and petty fines. But here's the thing. I don't break easily. I documented everything. Every fine, every letter, every desperate attempt at retaliation. I even installed security cameras, and within days I had footage of ho-ho circling members snooping around my property. They were desperate to catch me in a violation. And then Karen made her biggest mistake yet. One afternoon there was a knock at my door. Not a neighbor, not a delivery guy, 2 HOA board members standing inside my property, clipboard in hand. "We're here to conduct an inspection," one of them said, his voice shaky but authoritative. I folded my arms. "An inspection?" "Yes," the other one nodded. "There have been complaints about unauthorized modifications to your property." I slowly pointed at my massive steel gate. "Do you see that fence?" They nodded. "That means this is private property," I said, my voice calm but laced with steel. "And you just admitted you entered without permission." Their faces drained of color. I pulled out my phone and held it up, showing them the live security footage of them trespassing. "Illegal entry," I said. "Harassment." I paused, then smiled. "So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave, right now, or I'm calling the police." They didn't even argue. They bolted. And the next morning, Karen received an official cease and desist letter from my lawyer. I had just turned the tables. And Karen? She was running out of moves. Karen's defeat at the meeting should have been the end of it. Any rational person would have accepted their loss, licked their wounds, and moved on. But Karen wasn't irrational. No, Karen was a tyrant, stripped of her crown, a dictator watching her empire crumble, and she was going to do everything in her power to claw her way back. And so the next morning, the retaliation began. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, only to find yet another bright red violation notice taped to my door. This time, noise violation, unauthorized construction. I nearly spit out my coffee. My construction had been finished for a week. They were just making things up now. At the afternoon, another fine appeared, trash bin misalignment. Apparently my garbage can was positioned half an inch too far from the curb. By the end of the week I had received 5 separate violation notices, one for grass height, one for excessive foot traffic, whatever that meant, and another for visual obstruction due to the gate casting an unpleasant shadow. Karen was throwing everything at me, hoping to drown me in paperwork and fines until I finally caved, except she underestimated one thing. I don't break easily. Instead of backing down, I documented everything. Every fine, every notice. I even installed extra security cameras, just in case she tried something even more desperate. And as it turned out, that precaution would prove very useful, because 3 nights later, at exactly 11:47 p.m., my motion sensor cameras caught movement. I opened the security feed on my phone, and there they were, 2 HOA board members inside my property, sneaking around with flashlights like cartoon burglars. I hit record. One of them, a scrawny guy in an ill-fitting polo, walked right up to my gate, clipboard in hand. His partner, a slightly stockier man, leaned in close, measuring the distance from the gate to the sidewalk. "Looks like it's right on the property line," Polo Shirt whispered. "Damn it," Stocky grumbled. Karen was hoping it was off by at least a few inches. "We need a new angle." I barely contained my laughter. "Oh, Karen, you really don't know where to quit." The next morning I sent a mass email to the entire HOA board, every homeowner in the neighborhood, and, just for fun, a lawyer specializing in harassment cases, subject unlawful trespassing, video evidence attached. I kept the email short and sweet. "Dear HOA board, I woke up this morning to review my security footage and was surprised to find 2 board members illegally trespassing on my property late last night. Per the attached footage, they were seen measuring my gate in an attempt to manufacture a violation. I assumed this was done under the direction of Karen. As trespassing is a criminal offense, I am prepared to take legal action if this harassment continues. Additionally, I will be submitting this footage to the city authorities and local news outlets if necessary. I suggest the HOA reconsider its stance on targeting individual homeowners before this situation escalates further. Sincerely, your favorite neighbor." I hit send. Then I sat back and waited for the fireworks. Within 30 minutes, my phone exploded with notifications. Neighbors started replying to the email thread, some expressing outrage, others amusement. But the best part, Karen didn't respond. She was silent, which meant one thing. She was scrambling, and I was just getting started. Karen had overplayed her hand. I had given her every opportunity to walk away, to accept that she'd lost, and to move on with what little dignity she had left. But no, people like Karen never just move on. They dig in, they double down, and when their power starts slipping, they grasp at whatever straws they can find. And now, Her desperation had crossed a legal line. The moment I sent the security footage to the entire HOA board, the silence was deafening. No excuses, no spin, no half-baked justifications, just silence. That told me everything. Karen was scrambling, trying to contain the damage. And as much as I would have loved to sit back and watch her sweat, I knew better. She wasn't done yet. She was just regrouping and needed to make sure that when she did try again, she wouldn't just lose a battle, she'd lose the war. So I went on the offensive. First, I hired a property attorney, not because I needed one just yet, but because I wanted Karen to know I had one. The moment she received the cease and desist letter on official legal letterhead, I knew she'd feel the pressure. Second, I filed a formal complaint with the city, complete with video evidence of the board members trespassing. If she wanted to play dirty, I was going to make sure the authorities were watching her every move. And finally, I started talking to my neighbors, because here's the thing about HOA tyrants like Karen, they rely on fear. They count on people being too scared, too tired, or too indifferent to fight back. But once people realize they're not alone, once they see that someone else is standing up and winning, that's when the house of cards comes crashing down, and crash it did. The first crack appeared the very next day. My neighbor Mike stopped me as I was getting my mail. "I saw your email," he said, glancing around as if Karen had spies lurking in the bushes. "And I think it's time someone showed you this." He handed me a folder, thick, heavy, filled with years of HOA financial reports. Karen had been skimming money for years. There were thousands of dollars in unexplained miscellaneous expenses, payments for community improvements that never actually happened. But the best part? A $5,000 payment to a contractor for a project that didn't even exist, one that just so happened to be owned by Karen's brother-in-law. I let out a low whistle. "Mike, where did you get this?" Mike smirked. I was on the HOA board for a while. Karen thought she ran everything, but she was sloppy with the paperwork. I kept copies just in case. "Well, Mike," I grinned, "today is just in case." That night I sent another email, but this time it wasn't just about my gate. This time I attached every single financial document Mike had given me. I CC'd every homeowner in the neighborhood. I CC'd the entire HOA board. And, just for good measure, I CC'd the state's HOA fraud investigation office. Then I sat back and waited, and the next morning, the real fireworks began. Karen had thrown her final punch, but instead of knocking me down, she had just handed me the perfect opportunity to bury her for good. The zoning department's rejection of her complaint had sent a ripple through the neighborhood. The once silent homeowners were talking now, on sidewalks, over fences, in whispered conversations at the mailbox. The fear was fading. The iron grip Karen had held over this community for years was weakening. And then Mike showed up at my door. He wasn't the same quiet, keep-his-head-down Mike I had known before. No, the man standing in front of me was ready for war. He held out a thick folder, his expression set in stone. "I saw your email," he said, "and I think it's time someone showed you this." Inside were years of HOA financial records, neatly organized, every questionable transaction highlighted in red. It was worse than I imagined. There were thousands of dollars in unexplained expenses. Funds that were supposed to be used for community maintenance but had mysteriously disappeared into miscellaneous fees. HOA dues had been raised repeatedly, and yet sidewalks still cracked, streetlights still flickered, and the so-called community projects had never materialized. Then, the smoking gun, a $5,000 payment to a non-existent contractor, a company that didn't even exist outside of HOA records, except, as Mike helpfully pointed out, the contractor was Karen's brother-in-law. She had been skimming money for years, lining her pockets while pretending to enforce order. I let out a low whistle. "Mike, this is insane. Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Mike shrugged. "Tried once. Karen made my life hell for months. Fines, threats. I backed off, figured it wasn't worth it. But now?" His eyes darkened. "Now I think it's very worth it." And just like that, Karen's empire was about to crumble. At night, I sent another email, but this one wasn't just about my gate. This one had attachments, every single financial document Mike had given me, every questionable transaction, every dollar that had vanished. And just to really drive the point home, I CC'd every homeowner, every HOA board member, and most importantly, the state's HOA fraud investigation office. Then I sat back and waited, and the next morning, the neighbors were clutching copies of my email, waving papers in the air, demanding answers. The HOA office, normally quiet and ignored, had become a war zone. Karen was there, of course, red-faced, surrounded by angry homeowners. She was losing control, and she knew it. Then Linda, One of the other board members and one of Karen's older supporters did something I never expected. She slammed a folder onto the table at the front of the meeting hall. "This is fraud, Karen," Linda snapped. "You've been using our dues like your personal piggy bank." Karen shook her head wildly. "It's a misunderstanding. Those payments were all for community improvements." I stepped forward, holding up a printed copy of her brother-in-law's fake contract. "Oh, really? Then maybe you can explain where this contractor is? Because I called the listed number, and you know what? It doesn't exist." Silence. Then Linda stood up. "I motioned to remove Karen from the HOA board," she said. A second voice chimed in immediately. "Seconded." Karen's face went pale. "You can't do this. I am the HOA president." I leaned in, just enough for her to hear me. Not anymore. The vote was unanimous. Karen was done. She tried one last desperate move, screaming about lawsuits, ranting about conspiracies, but no one was listening anymore, because she wasn't in power anymore. She had lost everything. And 2 weeks later, the state charged her with fraud and embezzlement. Karen was forced to pay back thousands of dollars in stolen funds. She was banned from ever serving on an HOA board again, and the final cherry on top, she was so humiliated that she moved out of the neighborhood entirely, and my 10-foot steel gate, still standing, Karen's fall from grace, should have been the end of it. She had been stripped of power, exposed for fraud, and publicly humiliated. But even as the walls of her empire crumbled, I had a feeling she wasn't quite done sinking yet. Because when you spend years weaponizing an HOA against your own neighbors, you don't just walk away. You leave behind a trail of damage. And as it turned out, Karen's reign had left plenty of loose ends. 2 weeks after the vote to remove her from power, the state audit concluded, confirming every suspicion we had. Tens of thousands of dollars in misallocated funds, dozens of fraudulent payments, fake contractors, falsified invoices, and the final nail in the coffin, an additional $12,000 in unauthorized administrative fees, direct deposits, straight into Karen's personal bank account. The audit wasn't just damning, it was criminal. And that's when the police got involved. I'll never forget the moment the squad cars rolled up in front of her house. I was sipping coffee on my porch, enjoying the first truly peaceful morning since this entire ordeal began, when I heard the unmistakable sound of knocking on Karen's front door, but not the friendly kind. On my spot, I had the perfect view as she opened it, saw the officers, and immediately turned ghost white. It was glorious, Karen tried to argue, waving her hands, shaking her head, but the officers weren't interested in excuses. One of them handed her the warrant and her expression shattered. The neighborhood had front row seats as they led her out in handcuffs. A few people actually cheered. And me? I just raised my coffee cup in salute. Karen was just kicked off the HOA board. She was going to court. The fallout from her embezzlement scandal spread like wildfire. Local news picked up the story. Homeowners who had blindly followed her suddenly started backpedaling, claiming they had no idea what she had been doing. The HOA board, now under completely new leadership, went into damage control mode, scrambling to undo the mess she had left behind, and for the first time in years, the HOA actually started working for the homeowners, not against them. They revoked every arbitrary fine she had imposed, they reversed the ridiculous aesthetic rules, and most importantly, they cut HOA fees in half, because without Karen padding the budget with fake expenses, turns out they didn't actually need all that money. It was a new era for the neighborhood, and Karen, well, after months of legal battle, she was officially found guilty of fraud and embezzlement. She was forced to pay back every stolen cent, which, from what I heard, meant she had to sell her house. And so, one crisp fall morning, as I once again enjoyed my coffee from my driveway, I watched as a moving truck pulled up to Karen's house. For hours, they packed up her things, loading furniture, boxes, and whatever remnants of her failed dictatorship she still had left. And finally, just as the sun started to set, Karen herself stepped outside. She lingered for a moment, standing at the end of her driveway, staring out at the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist.